Recently, I've been contemplating a lot on the story of the Bible, or the story of the five books of Moses specifically. And I've been trying to think of it in terms of Moses being an enlightened guru who unfortunately was also a political leader and was seen by most people as nothing more than a respected political leader. With that perspective, you can read the whole Bible in a whole different way. Starting from, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, all the way up to Moses seeing the burning bush and feeling the presence of God. So if we imagine that Moses, having grown up in the castle of the Pharaoh, was very well taken care of as in a material sense. Everything he wanted was available, was provided. What does a person like that do? They start to think about the purpose of their life and think about serving the community, their fellow Israelites. And then at the same time, he saves an Israelite from getting beaten by an Egyptian guard and is forced to flee the country. Now, Moses in the desert by himself is able to contemplate more deeply on the meaning and purpose of life. And Moses, tending the sheep of his father-in-law, Jethro, has plenty of time on his hands to think about and feel for other living beings like the sheep. And if we imagine that ultimately through contemplation upon the origin of life and the purpose of living, if we imagine that he ultimately came upon that realization that at his essence, he is the consciousness that supports all of life, all experiences. And with sustained contemplation and meditation, Moses could have merged his personality, his identity with the consciousness within. Now, having merged with the consciousness, Moses is in a state of absolute fulfillment. He doesn't need to go back to Egypt. He doesn't need to stay in the desert. He doesn't need anything specific. But he determines that it's his duty, it's his obligation out of gratitude toward those who have raised him and those who he grew up with, his people, to go back and rescue them, help them get out of enslavement in Egypt. Possibly with the hope of maybe sharing some of the wisdom that he gained during contemplation. But unfortunately, he finds that most people that he rescued from enslavement are not ready, they're not prepared, they're not open for spiritual wisdom. They're mostly looking for practical tips on how to live their life and just how to survive in the desert. So he's seen as a political leader first and foremost. kind of like Mahatma Gandhi or George Washington or Nelson Mandela, someone who basically freed a people from a position of enslavement, a position of subservience. And so it's very difficult for him to communicate the wisdom that he acquired to people who are not really looking for it. There's a principle in the Indian scriptures, which is that knowledge can never be forced upon a person, or wisdom can never be forced. Parents always try and convince their children what they think is the right thing to do. You're trying to share the wisdom that you gain through experience, but you can't force it on them. If they're not open to it, if they're not interested in listening, it's very, very difficult to get someone to have faith in the wisdom that you have acquired. So here's Moses, having redeemed the Israelites from enslavement, is now seen as a political leader and struggles to try and share the wisdom that he acquired. He tries to tell them that what he is saying is from a position of godhood, from a position of having merged his identity with the supreme reality, with the consciousness that pervades everything and everyone. And having removed his ego, and as is said in the Bible, he's the most humble. Most humble doesn't mean comparing to other people. It means the most humble that a person could be. He simply tells the story objectively. He tells his own birth story or his own origin story in an objective manner. Look, this is what happened to this person, and this is how this person went about gaining enlightenment. So he's stuck in the desert with these hundreds of thousands or millions of people, depending on how you count. And none of them are really able to, they don't have the capability, they don't have the openness, the interest in gaining that spiritual enlightenment. They're just looking for tips on how to live a better life. All they knew was enslavement in Egypt. So what do you do now that you're free? How do you live a free life? So you could think of all of the commandments, the 10 Commandments, and any other do's and don'ts that he offered to them as guidance for a people that simply could not handle, simply weren't looking for, weren't interested in, weren't seeking the deeper meaning and purpose of life, but felt an extreme level of gratitude for redemption from Egypt, for redemption from enslavement, and for Moses having saved them from the life that they were living. So they were very willing to follow his advice and his do's and don'ts, his commandments. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, etc., etc., etc. And in and through all of this, it was Moses' wisdom. The wisdom of Moses is that he tried to teach them about enlightenment in a very indirect way. So you can imagine that they were very, very grateful to the God that Moses was saying had redeemed them. Now, what does that even mean, that God redeemed them? When you merge with the all-pervading consciousness, there is an identification with all beings, and there's an identification with the suffering of everyone. So Moses, having merged with God, having merged with the pure consciousness, identifies with these enslaved people. He feels their pain. And by using the power of thinking, reasoning, he may have organized a rebellion against the Egyptians. I'm not saying that this is definitely historically accurate, but it's one possible interpretation that Moses came back to Egypt and organized a rebellion of the Israelites against the Egyptians. Maybe they dumped blood in the Nile and attracted frogs. All the 10 plagues. You could think of ways to create these plagues. And then somehow they got across the Red Sea after all the 10 plagues were over. There could have been a tunnel, there could have been a narrow crossing, whatever it may be, a temporary dam. Somehow he planned out the redemption of the Israelites from Egypt and helped organize a rebellion to enable them to flee, escape, and then drown the Egyptians. Now, Moses is telling this story in the 5 books of Moses. He's telling it probably toward the end of his life or during the 40 years in the desert. And you could think of it in as a kind of sarcastic or frustrated or condescending way to describe what happened. Looking back, you guys think that this was a miracle. It was God that did it. Meaning, it was the consciousness. I didn't do it. Moses is saying, I didn't do these things. It's the consciousness that I've merged with that enabled all of these things to take place. The consciousness which enlivens the intellect to think and come up with solutions and organize people and enable the uprising. So Moses is trying to point them toward this consciousness, but the people they misunderstand it out of innocence. It's not that they intentionally misunderstood it, but they just couldn't swallow this idea that the consciousness is within each and every one of them and that that's what God is. So they started projecting it into the world. They need to have some form for God. And that's how they created this golden calf. Well, that's why they created it. The golden calf was meant to symbolize God. But to Moses, this was a form, and he was trying to lead them toward the formless reality, the eternal, that which is beyond space and time, not restricted to any form. So all of the commandments that he gave them, the tabernacle that he said that they should build, the holidays that commemorate the redemption from Egypt, the phylacteries that are meant to be bound across from the heart and above the head or between the eyes, which means in the mind. But put that aside. All of the things that he commanded them, we could go through them one by one if you're really interested. But all of the commandments were meant to help them channelize their gratitude for redemption from Egypt toward the consciousness which enabled it, as opposed to dumping it on Moses or creating this outward form and starting to worship an outward form, a golden calf. So this is a different way of conceptualizing the whole Bible, the whole story of the Bible. And I look forward to expounding more on details, but You could look at the first portion of the Bible as Moses explaining how the world comes about out of nothingness. Before everything, before the first experience, was consciousness. Consciousness is beyond space and time. It existed before the very first experience. And after the first experience, you have the second experience. And this is why we call the unit of time a second, because it's the second experience. Before the experience is consciousness. So in the first second, you have the first experience, and then the second you have the second experience. So it's always going to be, experience is always second to consciousness, is always after consciousness existing. Now, with consciousness existing on its own without a form, now the first thought, or in Sanskrit, the first vasana, which is the seed of thought, the first seed of thought. If you think of a tree as a fully formed being, as a fully formed object, before that is the sapling, and before that is the seed. So the seed of thought, which is unmanifest, it's before thought comes about. Vasana causes a thought. So the seed of thought causes a thought to sprout, to take form, to take root. And then it begins to grow. So before the first thought was just consciousness. Now you have consciousness with the first vasana. First vasana, the first seed of thought, needs a place or a field for it to germinate in. Every experience needs a field of experience. If you're experiencing this video, there's some location where you're experiencing it. You have the internet connectivity, you have the device that's streaming the video. So it's a field of experience. And then, so the field of experience begins with the mere separation of light and dark. So that's the first manifestation of a field of experience. You could think of it like turning on your computer or turning on the TV. The first thing that comes up is just some light, or some points of light and some points of dark. And then the rest of it takes shape. So this is just a way of explaining how things take shape from the first thought, or from the first vasana. And then after the first thought, you get light and day. You separate that into day and night. There are times when it's light, there are times when it's dark. One day. Good. Now all the other forms that need to be in that field of experience are manifested. So there's a thought of day and night. There's a thought of the sun and the moon. So degrees of light and dark. So rather than just having black and white, there are degrees of light and dark. There's shades of gray, maybe color, various mixtures of color. And then you get trees and all kinds of grass growing, and fruits and vegetation growing. And then animals. And then finally, the chef d'oeuvre of creation, the pinnacle of creation, is the avatar that the consciousness takes in order to experience the field of experience. You could create a video game, but if you don't have an avatar to experience that field of experience, then it's just a video. So something has to be experiencing what is experienced, and that is the human being, the person, the avatar of consciousness. Consciousness enlivens the human being to experience the objects of the world. So there's experiencer and experienced world. experienced objects. And then the next thought comes about where you have a thought of promulgating, procreating, having more avatars. So you get the first thing is that out of Adam comes Eve, and then companionship, relationship, progeny, children, offspring. And then there's the fall from that perfected state. So in Indian philosophy, in Vedanta, you would say that the fall took place before the first thought. When the first vasana came about, when the first seed of thought came about, that's when the fall actually began. But the real, or the illustration of the fall in the Garden of Eden, where Garden of Eden is not absolute peace and bliss, but everything is pretty good. It's everything grows on its own. There's plenty for everyone. And the next thought is one of desire, of want, of wanting to gain some knowledge, of wanting to experience knowledge. And this is the fall. The fall is the ongoing promulgation and expansion of thoughts, of desires, of letting desires grow and build on themselves and become endless and numberless. So this is how Moses describes the origin of man. And toward the end of his life, he says, you guys want to go into Israel? Yes, it's your origin, land of origin, great. You want to go for that? Great. But my purpose is to stay here in the desert and teach you as best I can. So out of respect for Moses, you could say, out of devotion to Moses, out of gratitude toward Moses, they stayed in the desert until he passed away, until he finally died. And then they did what they wanted to do, which is create a homeland in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, and make it their own. But none of this was really Moses' point. Moses wasn't all about that. That wasn't his thing. Moses' idea, his whole purpose, was to try and lead the people in a very concealed way, in a very kind of deliberate but quiet way, in his own way, to try and get them back to their origin, which is what he talks about at the beginning of the 5 books of Moses, how the world came about. Pure consciousness exists on its own. Then there's the first vasana, the first seed of thought, and from that springs all of existence, everything that you experience. So the purpose of life, which Moses was trying to hint at, is to get back to that state of pure consciousness, to merge your identity, as Moses did, with the all-pervading consciousness, to remove the ego, to be humble, as Moses was, and to get back to that state of pure consciousness beyond the waking, dream, and deep sleep states. That state of consciousness which exists on its own and enlivens the 3 states of conditioned consciousness, where you experience either the waking world, the dream state, or the deep sleep state. And just to wrap it up, the whole story of Moses, or the 5 books of Moses, was very difficult for me to accept. I was raised as an Orthodox Jew, and I learned it from an early age and believed the stories implicitly. But then as I became a teenager and started to think about it, I couldn't really accept that all of these stories literally happened the way they're described. And it made me question the whole thing and turn away from it and then seek the knowledge that I didn't know was hidden in the Bible, hidden in the 5 books of Moses. So if that was the purpose of Moses writing the 5 books of Moses, then he was successful in my case. He only gave out those precepts to the people who couldn't accept them. There may have been one or two who are not even named in the Bible who really understood what he was trying to explain, or really understood what he was aiming to lead them toward. Not their ancestral homeland, but their birthright as a human being, which is that pure consciousness which enlivens the human being. So there's a new appreciation that I have for the story of the 5 books of Moses, and an appreciation for the difficulty that Moses had in trying to communicate the philosophy or the wisdom that he gained through contemplation. So it's a very interesting story now, looking back at the entire 5 books of Moses. It becomes a very different story when you have this perspective.